May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our God, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. Anyone here this morning like Super Bowl commercials? I love them. I love TV commercials in general. And not recently, I guess anymore, it started back in about 2010. There was a series of TV commercials that I really liked. And it was the Snickers TV commercials. Anybody remember those? They started coming out about 2010 and they ran till about 2018, I think. And they used celebrities. And what they would do is they would place these celebrities in different situations. One of my favorite had Joe Pesci and Don Rickles. So Joe Pesci, you know Joe Pesci from the movie Goodfellas, one of the top 10 movies of all times in my opinion. But Joe Pesci in that movie was a gangster. And he was kind of this self-conscious, unsure of himself, loudmouth kind of gangster. Well, he plays that kind of character in this commercial. And it's Joe Pesci and this young guy. And they're at this house party. And they're talking to these two young, attractive young ladies. And they're introducing themselves. And there's somebody that walks behind them. And one of the young ladies kind of glances away for a second to watch the person walk by. And Joe Pesci says, "What are you looking at? What's wrong? We're not good enough for you?" So his buddy grabs him by the arm and quickly ushers him into the kitchen and hands him a Snickers bar. And as soon as he takes the first bite, he's transformed back into himself. And they go back and they talk to the young ladies, and the friend says, "So, ladies," and then the camera pans over, and instead of two ladies, it's one young lady and Don Rickles, and Don Rickles says, "So, losers." The tagline for the commercial was, "You're not you when you're hungry." I think that might be what's going on in our gospel passage this morning from Matthew. Jesus' response to the Canaanite woman is completely out of character for what we would expect Jesus to say to somebody. In fact, I think Peter should have handed him a snack and said, "Here, Jesus, maybe you're a little hungry." But what's going on in this passage? Why would Jesus respond in this way? Let's look at that part of the gospel passage. It's completely out of character. This woman in need, this woman whose daughter is tormented by a demon, comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, Son of God, help me." And what does he do? He ignores her. He didn't say anything. And then she says something else. And the disciples come to him and say, "Hey, Jesus, this woman is being really annoying. She's kind of loud. Get rid of her." And he says, "I'm not here for her. I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel." But she persists. And she comes and she kneels at his feet. And she says, "God, please help me." And then he insults her. He calls her a dog. Not what you would expect from Jesus, the Son of God. So, what's going on here? How can we explain this passage and make it seem a little easier to swallow? Well, there's two traditional interpretations of this particular passage. The first interpretation is that Jesus is making this woman pass a test before she can feel like she's receiving God's grace and mercy, that it's all a test. I got problems with that. I don't think I like that interpretation. I mean, if this is where Jesus is actually extending God's grace and mercy past the kingdom of Israel, which is how this interpretation goes, how do you explain the fact that Jesus has already performed miracles in the Gentile community? Jesus has already healed people that are not of the house of Israel. Jesus has just fed the 5,000. Surely many of them were not Jewish. So I'm not sure that interpretation makes a lot of sense. The other classical interpretation of this passage is that the Canaanite woman changes Jesus' mind. That Jesus is following the Jewish tradition that the Messiah was brought to earth to save the people of Israel. that the people of Israel are God's chosen people. Got to be honest with you, I'm not sure I buy that interpretation either. For some of the same reasons as I don't buy the previous interpretation, but even more so with this one. If Jesus is the Son of God, and we believe that Jesus is without sin, how do we excuse this sinful behavior? If you and I were to treat another person that way, we would consider that a sin. So, and on top of that, I'm not sure that any of us ever change God's mind about anything. So that interpretation really isn't helpful for me either. So what are we left to do? I think if we look at this passage in the context of the entire chapter from which it comes, it might make a little more sense. So we're in chapter 15 of Matthew's Gospel. And the chapter starts out with the Pharisees and the scribes coming to Jesus. And they're protesting that Jesus and his disciples do not follow the traditions of the elders. The tradition, the law of Moses, dictates that the people of Israel should wash their hands before they eat. And Jesus and his disciples don't wash their hands. So Jesus gets into this back and forth about this practice of hand washing before you eat. And this is the first spot in Matthew's Gospel that Jesus looks the Pharisees and the scribes directly in the face and he calls them hypocrites. He says, it's not about washing your hands. You guys are so concerned about following the law that you forgot why the law exists. Jesus calls them hypocrites. And then he goes on and he quotes the prophet Isaiah. And he says, people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. These gestures are empty gestures. These gestures of washing your hands to follow the law are merely rote behaviors that have lost their meaning. And then he goes further. And that's when we get into the passage from today about, things that defile. That there are clean foods and unclean foods. And that if we put unclean foods in our mouth, it makes us unclean. And Jesus says that's hogwash. That's hooey. It's not about what goes into your mouth. It's about what comes out of your mouth. He tells them, the food that goes in your mouth goes out into the sewer. What comes out of your mouth is important. And if we're going to follow the law of Moses, we need to do it for a reason. We need to do it to make sure that we're treating others the way that we want to be treated. We want to say things that glorify God and each other and not tear each other down. So Jesus is building an argument here. Jesus is building an argument that following traditions for the sake of following traditions probably isn't the right thing, probably the right reason to do it. That following the law for the sake of following the law and not for taking care of each other is probably the wrong reason to do it. And this is where we get to the Canaanite woman. Because I think what happens here is Jesus goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So again, he's leaving Jewish territory. He's going to Gentile country. And he has this experience with this outsider. All of those laws, all of those practices that the Pharisees were getting upset about were intended to keep the people of Israel separate from everyone else. To keep those people the chosen people of God. But it neglected God's will for all of God's people. So Jesus, by going to the region of Tyre and Sidon, having this interaction with the Canaanite woman, I think is an object lesson. I think Jesus is showing the disciples what he was talking about in those previous two passages. I think Jesus is actually showing them in real life that it doesn't matter the traditions that you follow. It doesn't matter the rules that you keep. It doesn't even matter where you come from. that God's grace and mercy transcend all of those things. Now, that doesn't completely explain away some of the issues with Jesus' interaction, but I think it helps explain what might be going on. I think Jesus knew that God's grace and mercy extended to this woman. I think Jesus knew that this woman's faith was strong. But it's like teaching my 9-year-old how to read. If he comes across a word that he doesn't understand, I don't just tell him what the word is. I help him sound it out. In this lesson, Jesus is helping the disciples sound out what it means to extend God's grace and mercy to all of God's people, regardless of tradition, regardless of adherence to the law, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. Sisters and brothers, the entirety of the 15th chapter of Matthew, I think, is a story of inclusion. It's a story of Jesus saying that, yes, the people of Israel are God's chosen people, but all of us are chosen by God to receive God's grace and mercy. And we are called to extend that grace, regardless of the traditions that we follow, the rules that we think we need to adhere to, or where we come from. That, I think, is the point of this encounter. So, sisters and brothers, when we leave here today, may we all be reminded that God's grace and mercy extends to you, and it extends to you, and it extends to you, and it extends to everybody out there. Because it doesn't matter what tradition you come from, or what laws you follow, or where you come from, or what you look like. God's grace and mercy is for all of us. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.